You know, lately it really feels like the global atmosphere is a little, well, tense, doesn't it?
Oh, definitely.
Especially when you look at the whole U.S.-China dynamic, it makes you wonder where things are headed.
There's certainly a real sense of anticipation, maybe unease, about shifts in global power. And everything's so connected now, these changes feel significant.
Absolutely. And that's exactly what we're trying to unpack today. You sent over a really great mix of materials.
Yeah.
News reports, some deep analysis from think tanks, even discussions from places like Reddit. It gives a pretty wide view of U.S. foreign policy, China's reaction, and, how the rest of the world is taking it all in.
Well, the idea was to get that mix.
Yeah.
Because you have the sort of high-level geopolitical strategy.
Right.
But then you also get those more on-the-ground reactions, the immediate takes. It helps paint a fuller picture, I think.
Totally agree. So our mission here for this deep dive is basically to pull out the key insights from all that. Help everyone listening get a handle on the main trends, the potential fallout, and the different viewpoints without getting totally lost in the weeds.
Sounds like a plan.
Okay, so let's dive in. China first. What are the sources telling us about how they're playing things right now?
Well, what really stands out is how proactive China seems to be. It's not just watching things unfold.
Proactive how?
The analysis suggests they're actively preparing, bracing, maybe, for different potential futures, especially thinking about, say, a possible second Trump term in the U.S.
Okay.
So they're, trying to buffer their economy, lock down their interests through trade and investment globally, and really making an effort to strengthen ties with key partners, especially in the global south.
Right. So this isn't just talk then. We've seen them use economic clout for political ends before, haven't we?
Oh, absolutely. The sources mentioned several clear examples. Remember the T-J missile system deployment in South Korea?
Vaguely, yeah.
China hit back with what was basically an economic boycott of South Korean stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Or when Liu Xiaobo won the Nobel Peace Prize, Norway faced restrictions on its salmon exports to China.
Oh.
And there was that dispute with Japan where China restricted rare earth mineral exports. So yes, there's a definite pattern, using economic leverage for geopolitical goals. And the sources suggest that playbook is still very much active.
Got it. A consistent strategy. Now, one source mentioned President Xi directly calling for Asian unity. Something about an Asian family. What's the context there?
Yeah, that's interesting. If you look at it alongside China, preparing for maybe a tougher U.S. stance,
Mm-hmm.
then these calls for unity, this Asian family idea, it looks like a clear counter-narrative. It's positioned against what Beijing sees as U.S. pressure, U.S. hegemonism, dominance.
So setting up an alternative bloc almost.
In a way, his speeches in Malaysia and Cambodia really hammered this theme, urging them to resist external interference, what he called power politics.
And did these visits lead to anything concrete, deal sign, that sort of thing?
They did, yeah. With Malaysia, there were specific commitments, things like working closer on industry, supply chains, data, talent, aiming for a high-level strategic Malaysia-China community. And then in Vietnam, apparently 45 deals were signed, mostly economic strengthening. And significantly, the joint statements from both trips mentioned opposing unilateralism.
Which sounds like a pointed reference to potential U.S. actions.
That's certainly how it reads in this context, yes. Acting alone, ignoring others' interests, it's a clear signal.
And China seems to be highlighting supportive statements from other leaders, too.
For sure. The Chinese Foreign Ministry made a point of noting comments from Malaysia's Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim. He apparently spoke positively about Xi and also stated opposition to Taiwan independence and unilateral tariffs.
So a very coordinated diplomatic and economic push from China's side.
It certainly looks that way. Cultivating relationships, building that narrative against potential U.S. pressure.
Okay, so China's definitely making moves. But what about everyone else? Are other countries just falling in line, or is it more complicated? You mentioned wariness earlier.
That's really key. It's definitely more complicated.
Yeah.
While China's pushing its vision, the sources also show a lot of caution, especially among leaders in Europe and Asia.
Caution about what specifically?
About potential big swings in U.S. policy, particularly thinking about a possible second Trump presidency.
Right.
There's this feeling that U.S. foreign policy could reverse course quite dramatically, maybe even breathtakingly, as one source put it.
Right.
And that obviously raises questions. How reliable are American security guarantees? Is U.S. influence itself power weakening?
And does this uncertainty automatically push countries towards China, or are they looking at other options?
It's nuanced. Take the EU. There are signs they're re-engaging with China more. Planned summits, talks about tariffs restarting.
So a pragmatic shift.
You can see it that way, yeah. A pragmatic response if they anticipate more hostility from the U.S. side. But, and the sources stress, the EU isn't about to just, jump into China's arms.
Okay.
There's still a lot of caution there, too. It seems more about strengthening Europe's own position, keeping options open, not becoming overly reliant on either Washington or Beijing.
Managing risk, basically. Keeping flexible.
Exactly. U.S. allies are worried about potential U.S. actions, military force, big tariff hikes, and the fallout.
Like what?
Well, things like NATO weakening, tit-for-tat tariffs flying around, countries starting to seriously look for other partners if they feel the U.S. isn't reliable anymore.
It brings us to that idea of soft power. One source really argues the current U.S. approach is hurting it. Can you quickly explain soft power and how the U.S. is seen as, losing it?
Sure. Soft power is basically influence through attraction, not coercion or payment. It comes from a country's culture, its political ideals, its foreign policies. Think Hollywood, democratic values, foreign aid programs.
Yeah.
The argument in these sources is that the current administration is kind of abandoning that, pulling out of international groups, cutting foreign aid, U.S. aid specifically, and maybe disparaging allies sometimes.
Right.
And these actions, according to this view, undermine America's ability to persuade others, to have them want to align with U.S. interests.
Are there examples of those U.S. side cuts and their impact?
Yes. The sources detail pretty significant cuts. And the worry is that this leaves a vacuum.
A vacuum where?
Especially in places like Southeast Asia, Latin America, Africa regions, where U.S. aid and development work have historically been quite important.
And China steps in.
That's the concern. China, with things like its Belt and Road Initiative and just increased diplomatic focus, is very actively trying to fill that gap. The argument is, by cutting back on soft power, the U.S. is sort of unintentionally opening doors for China to build influence.
And this could shift loyalties long term.
That's the fear expressed. That it's not just about immediate influence, but potentially shifting economic and political ties for, future generations. It's seen as a long game issue.
A long-term strategic challenge, though.
Definitely. The trust and goodwill associated with soft power, it takes ages to build. The sources suggest it could take generations to rebuild if it's significantly eroded. That could fundamentally reshape things down the line.
Okay. So we've looked at China's strategy, the wider global nervousness, but the sources also touched on specific national approaches. Let's talk about Australia first.
Right. Australia's official line, based on the sources, is very much about having an independent foreign policy.
Meaning?
Meaning they stress engaging with everyone, U.S., China, others, but always based on Australia's own national interests. It's presented as a balancing act. Cooperate where interests align, but reserve the right to disagree. Maintain their own distinct path.
A careful balancing act. What about India? One source seemed to have a different take there.
Yeah, that was interesting. One perspective presented was that India is perhaps leaning more towards the U.S. relationship right now, and maybe seeing the U.S.-China tension less as a geopolitical problem and more as an economic opportunity for itself.
An opportunity? How so?
This source quotes India's commerce minister saying India is well poised to convert the current situation into an opportunity of a lifetime. It also mentions a commentator suggesting India open its agriculture to U.S. products to sort of curry favor with Washington, possibly at China's expense.
So less about solidarity, more about national gain.
That's the interpretation offered in that specific source, yes. A focus on immediate economic advantage driving their approach in this situation.
Okay. And Bangladesh came up, too, as a country China is actively courting.
That's right. The sources point to Bangladesh as a place China is increasingly looking towards for investment, especially as Beijing considers shifting some manufacturing elsewhere in Asia.
Part of a diversification strategy?
Seems like it. For Bangladesh, it's part of a longer-term move away from maybe being too reliant on the U.S. market. And China is actively engaging with diplomacy and investment to build those ties.
Right. So really different strategies playing out across different countries. Now, let's switch gears slightly to those Reddit discussions we mentioned.
Yes, the online chatter.
Specifically, that thread on our political discussion about a potential global coalition against the U.S. if things got really aggressive. What were people worried about there?
It was a fascinating snapshot of public anxiety, really. The big worries were about alienating allies through, confrontational policies or going it alone too much.
Okay.
Some people even brought up worst-case scenarios like military conflict, hypotheticals involving, say, Canada or Greenland, and whether that could trigger NATO's Article 5.
Wow, okay.
And definitely big concerns about the economic fallout and the U.S. potentially becoming isolated, a sort of pariah state, as some put it.
Serious concerns. Were there counter-arguments? More moderate views?
Oh, yeah. While the dramatic stuff got clicks, plenty argued a formal military coalition against the U.S. is pretty unlikely, just given U.S. military strength.
Makes sense.
But what seemed more plausible to many was a significant cooling of alliances. Negative economic consequences, for sure. And this idea that countries might become anti-Trump rather than fundamentally anti-American.
A distinction there.
Right. And some suggested that many countries might just try to, well, wait it out. Hope for a return to more predictable U.S. foreign policy later on.
Were there any really extreme scenarios thrown around in that discussion?
There were. You know how online forums can be. Some speculated about NATO dissolving entirely, or even major internal political turmoil within the U.S.
Like a civil war?
That was mentioned, yeah. Or even the idea of internal mechanisms being used to remove a president seen as acting, dangerously. Obviously highly speculative stuff. Yeah. But it does show the depth of anxiety some people feel about potential disruption on a global scale.
It really does. It underscores how these potential shifts are being felt and thought about everywhere, from high strategy down to, well, Reddit threads.
Exactly. It's clearly on a lot of people's minds from different angles.
Well, this has been quite the journey through a really complex landscape. If we try to boil it all down based on everything we've looked at, what are the main takeaways for people listening?
Okay, pulling it all together from the sources, I'd say a few key things stand out. First, China is definitely playing offense, strategically positioning itself for what it sees coming, trying to boost its influence.
Right.
Second, there's genuine unease among many nations, including traditional U.S. allies, about potential shifts in American policy. Questions about reliability are real. Third, there's this perception or argument that U.S. soft power is waning, and that's creating openings for others, notably China.
Okay.
And finally, the future of global alignments. Well, it's very fluid. Nations are hedging their bets, exploring different strategies to protect their interests in what feels like a more unpredictable world.
So, thinking about all that, China's push, the global wariness, the soft power questions, the different national responses, maybe final thought for our listeners to chew on?
Go for it.
Given all these perspectives we've just discussed, what do you listening think is the most likely long-term outcome of these shifting dynamics? And what role do you see different countries playing in whatever new international landscape emerges?
Yeah, that's the big question, isn't it?
It is. Lots to consider. Hopefully this deep dive has given everyone a clearer frame for thinking about it all. Thanks so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
And we definitely encourage everyone to keep following these crucial developments.